So today we're going to be talking about statutory foundations and charitable foundations. But before we get into that, as always, a little CYA. This is not tax or legal advice. If you need specific advice for your situation, get specific advice. This is just for educational purposes, but I hope you're going to find it useful. I think it's pretty good info. So, foundation confusion. So as most of you know, I do a lot of wealth structuring for people. So that's setting up their estate planning structures that are going to benefit and secure the financial security for future generations. It's going to offer succession planning benefits and asset protection and tax benefits and all that kind of stuff. Now, there's two primary types of entities that we utilize to set up these wealth structures. And they are trusts and they are foundations. Now, normally when I say foundations, people go, oh, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or like the Clinton Foundation. No, that is not what I'm talking about. Those are charitable foundations, right? Those are utilized to somehow benefit the public good. They're not used to benefit your kids. They can be, but probably you're going to go to jail for misappropriating funds that were meant to fulfill charitable purposes. The other type of foundation is what's called a statutory foundation. And I'm going to get into more detail of what that is, but think about a trust that's incorporated, like a company without shares. So a statutory foundation is used primarily for estate planning and wealth protection and stuff like that. So Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, charitable foundations. Foundation that I'm talking about for estate planning and wealth protection and stuff, statutory foundation. Big difference. So one of the things that causes a lot of confusion with charitable foundations, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Clinton Foundation, is they're not technically foundations, right? It's not entity type foundation. It's actually a trust or a corporation that has the word foundation in its name and has a tax exemption from the IRS. So typically, this is just, for example, a trust called blah blah foundation or a nonprofit corporation called blah blah foundation that then has an IRS tax exemption because it's fulfilling a charitable purpose. Now, you might look at supporting your kids as a charitable purpose, but the IRS is likely not going to agree with you. So they exist, like I said, to fulfill a charitable purpose, not a private purpose. Taking care of your kids and your heirs and future generations is going to be a private purpose. So when I start talking about foundations, I'm not talking about charitable foundations, I'm talking about statutory foundations. Now, a statutory foundation is a type of legal entity. So, you have corporations, you have LLCs. A statutory foundation is a legal entity like that. A lot of people in common law jurisdictions like the United States and the UK aren't familiar with this concept of a statutory foundation because this entity stems from the civil law legal system. But there are a lot of common law jurisdictions like the United States and Wyoming and New Hampshire that have now enacted foundations laws so that you have this entity type of foundation because it is such a powerful entity. And unlike a trust, and this is something where I think there's often a lot of times a little bit of confusion with trusts is people think that trusts are entities because you talk about them like entities, right? You put something in a trust. But a trust is actually not an entity. It's a contract between the settlor and the trustee. So the settlor is the one who's going to be, transferring the assets. The trustee is the one that's going to be controlling the assets for the benefit of the beneficiaries. And the trust, it is called a trust agreement, right? Is an agreement between, let's say me, the settlor who's going to put the assets in the trust and transfer them to the trustee, and the trustee who's going to control the assets for the benefit of the beneficiaries. It's nothing more than a contract. It's not a legal entity. That's why in a trust, it can't hold assets in the name of the trust. The assets have to be owned in the name of the trustee. And that's something where the foundation is really nice because it's an actual incorporated legal entity. It's like a company without shares, right? It has a board that manages it and all this other stuff, and we're going to get into some of that stuff. Now, a foundation can exist for public or private purposes, right? So a public purpose would be something that could be charitable, right? So you could have a legal entity type of foundation that also has foundation in its name and is, doing a public charitable purpose. But you can also have a private foundation that you would utilize very much like a trust. It's like to benefit your kids. It can still have foundation in the name, it's just not charitable unless, you might think of it as charitable if your kids are, charity cases. So let's talk about the parties to a foundation, and then we'll talk a little bit about its uses, and then we'll talk about some of its benefits and so on and so forth. So here's a little primer on foundations. So you have the founder. The founder, much like it sounds, is the person founding the foundation. It's much like a settler of a trust. So the founder is the one who's setting up the foundation and is transferring assets to it for the benefit of the foundation's beneficiaries. Now, the foundation is managed by a board of administrators, counselors, or directors. Depending on the jurisdiction where you set the foundation up, they have different names. Some call them directors, some jurisdictions call them counselors or administrators. It just depends. But for all intents and purposes, it's a board of directors that manages the affairs of the foundation, much like the board of directors of a company manages a company. And the board of directors of a foundation function much like a trustee of a trust, right? They're the one that are controlling everything. Then you have the beneficiaries. And the beneficiaries are the ones that are going to benefit under the foundation, much like the beneficiaries of a trust. And then you can have this concept of a guardian. And again, it's not called a guardian in every single jurisdiction. Some, pick different names. But the guardian is somebody who is attuned to a protector of a trust. And so the guardian can have certain powers, for example. So the guardian, for example, could have the power to remove and replace the directors. They could have the power to approve distribution. So the board can't make a distribution to a beneficiary without the consent of the guardian. It could be required that the foundation can't be moved to another jurisdiction without the consent of the guardian, or that it can't be amended without the consent of the guardian. So a lot of times what you do is the founder will found the foundation, transfer assets to it, and then appoint a professional board to manage the foundation. But then the founder will also be the guardian, or maybe they appoint a trusted family member, or a trusted advisor like a lawyer or something to act as guardian. And the guardian then kind of keeps an eye on the board of directors to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, and that they have to seek his approval for doing certain things like making distributions. And in this way, you don't have all the burden of managing the foundation, but you still have a safeguard in place to make sure that the board is not doing something or is doing, to make sure the board isn't doing something you don't want them to do. You can also have, for example, if you don't want to have a professional board, you can even have the founder on the board, some other family members, trusted advisors. So it's a really flexible structure. Now, let's talk about what some of the uses are for a foundation. And the uses are very similar to the uses of a trust, for example. So the first and foremost is estate planning. So you put your assets in the foundation, and then as an example, you could say, okay, the beneficiaries of the foundation are myself, the founder, my spouse, my kids, and any bloodline family descendant. So this basically covers generations, right? So you don't have a situation where the assets of the foundation need to actually be distributed to my kids or my grandkids or anybody else. You can have a situation where the foundation owns the assets and continues to own those assets in perpetuity, and then distributes income and so forth as needed to the beneficiaries, right? So essentially what you have is, this foundation here, right? And all the assets are in here, and then you have the beneficiaries. And every time a new generation comes into being, they just get added as a beneficiary class, and the trustee the foundation pays out income to them. And this is really great, right? Because the foundation always remains the owner of these assets and is just paying out income to the beneficiaries as needed or as the board decides. And this is really beneficial, right, for a lot of reasons. One, and I'm going to move a little bit backwards to succession planning, but let's talk about tax planning for a minute, okay? So if you have this foundation and the foundation owns the assets, and let's say you put the foundation somewhere with beneficial tax laws, like here in Dubai, right, where there's zero taxes. So now you have this income within the foundation that's not being subject to income tax here, and it makes distribution to the beneficiaries. So depending on where the beneficiaries live, they might have to pay tax on the distribution they receive from the foundation, but they don't have to pay tax on 100% of the income, right? Because the foundation owns the assets, not them. Likewise, because the assets always stay in the foundation and they don't actually get passed from generation to generation, you don't have a state tax diluting these assets from year to year, right? Because assets continue to be owned by the foundation and just the benefits are being paid out to the beneficiaries. And also, because the foundation is the owner rather than the beneficiaries, you have potential wealth tax savings, right? You can't have a country subject you to wealth taxes on assets you don't own. The foundation owns them in a secure location like here in Dubai. So there's a lot of benefits from a tax standpoint to putting assets in a foundation. The other one is wealth protection, right? Because the foundation owns the assets and not the beneficiaries, the creditors of the beneficiaries can't get the assets in the foundation because the beneficiaries don't own the assets, right? And this is a really, I mean, there's lawsuits and everything else that are going to protect the foundation. And, you know, like here in the UAE, the law says that the UAE is not going to recognize foreign judgments, right? So it's not a judgment from a court here. They're just going to ignore it. It doesn't apply. But one of the biggest benefits that I see from an asset protection standpoint, you know, most families are not, you know, getting sued all the time where you need this structure that's going to, you know, constantly be fending off attack from people. But there are more subtle asset protection benefits that are really fantastic. And I'll give you an example. If you come from a wealthy family, what's one of the things that the kids, when they get married, need to do? Generally, get a prenuptial agreement, right? And this obviously is not something that's very nice. It causes friction between the heir and their spouse. There's potential distrust. It's just not a nice conversation. But if the assets are in a foundation, this heir doesn't own anything, right? So it makes the need for a prenup much less. Because if they get divorced, the heir doesn't have anything. Everything's owned by the foundation. This is a huge, huge benefit. You also have succession planning. So you would draft into the foundation's governing documents how the board is to be replaced, right? So there may be provisions for, you know, the board naming successors, or that the guardian can name the successors. All of this succession is built in, and we can even put in, you know, who qualifies to be on the board member, right? Like a minimum age, a minimum experience, or education requirement. You can even say that, okay, X number of family members need to be on the board and X number of, you know, professional advisors. You can do whatever you want, but that's really important that you have this succession of control, that the assets continue to be managed so they last for generations, right? And then finally, you want financial privacy for you and your heirs. You don't want it all out in the public, you know, that they're a beneficiary of this foundation worth $100 million. You want privacy, and so it's important to set up, if you're thinking about a foundation, to set up in a jurisdiction where you're not going to have public beneficial owner registers. The UAE happens to be such a jurisdiction. In a lot of situations, I think that foundations are far superior than trusts, and I usually lean towards recommending foundations over trusts, unless it's situations where, for example, you have somebody who's in the UK, right? Or in the US, where their tax laws have a difficult time dealing with foundations because it's not a very recognized entity there, so sometimes the trusts are going to be better. But in general, I think that foundations are far superior. And I'm going to go through the reasons. So one, it's a separate legal entity, right? that's registered somewhere and can own assets in its own name. And I think that's, right here, own assets in its own name, because that's really important. It's not the trustee that needs to own the assets on behalf of the beneficiaries. The foundation owns those assets in its own right. It can exist in perpetuity. So the foundation can exist forever. A lot of jurisdictions put limits on how long trusts can exist. And now some of them are, basically in perpetuity, right? 1,000 years. But in some jurisdictions, some jurisdictions are shorter. But it is nice to know that you can have it exist in perpetuity. It's also an orphan structure, right? So nobody owns a foundation. It just exists without owners on its own. And that's really cool, because if you own something, somebody can sue you and take it. And if it's in a foundation, you don't own it. Now, somebody could sue the foundation, which is why you have to operate the foundation in a very risk-averse way. But that is a huge benefit of the foundation. It's this orphan structure. Nobody owns it. You don't need to worry about who you're going to leave it to when you die. That's all taken care of in the foundation's governing documents. It can enter into contracts in its own right, because it is a legal entity, unlike a trust who has to enter into contracts in the trustee's name. It can sue and be sued in its own name, just like a company. Again, trust can't do that. The trustee has to do it. One of the nice things is the beneficiaries have no interest in the foundation's assets. So normally with a trust, the beneficiaries have some type of interest in the trust, right? They have some inherent rights to the assets in the trust, which makes the trustee have some liability towards the beneficiaries because he owes them a fiduciary duty. Generally speaking, the directors, the board of a foundation, do not owe a fiduciary duty to the beneficiaries, but to the foundation itself. So they're administering the assets for the benefit of the foundations, not the beneficiaries, even though the beneficiaries can't benefit. And this gives the directors a much lower liability threshold, which makes it nice for higher risk assets like privately held companies or family businesses and stuff like that. And that's something that I think a lot of people value, and gets it easier to get people on board to help serve on the board of directors or whatever. I hope that this is not only explain the difference between charitable foundations and statutory foundations, but also giving you an idea of some of the benefits that statutory foundations have to offer in wealth structuring context, because they're immense. If you have any more questions, hit us up. Contact details right here. Have a good day. Peace.